The train from the east hissed and groaned as it pulled into the small, sun-bleached station of sundown New Mexico territory. Dust rolled across the platform like smoke from a dying fire, and the few townsfolk who'd gathered shielded their faces from the wind. Among the passengers stepping down from the iron beast was a young woman who looked terribly out of place in the rough Western world. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, 23 years old, pale from a lifetime spent under Boston's gray skies. She clutched a worn carpetbag to her chest, her gloved hands trembling slightly. The lace trim of her bonnet fluttered as she looked around, trying to hide the uncertainty in her eyes. Everything around her seemed too big, too loud. The wide sky, the call of the telegraph, the smell of dust and horses. At the far end of the platform, leaning against a post, stood the man she had come to marry, Koa Redhawk. He was an Apache, tall, broad-shouldered, and striking in a way that made everyone else seem smaller. His hair was long and tied back with leather, his eyes dark as onyx. He wore a buckskin shirt, weathered trousers, and a simple hat pulled low against the sun. The murmurs around the station grew louder as he straightened and walked toward her. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. An Apache taking a white bride? Reckon she knows what she's getting into? Eleanor heard them, but pretended not to. Koa stopped a few feet away, his presence filling the space between them like the hush before a storm. "Eleanor Hayes?" he asked in a deep, quiet voice that carried easily over the wind. She nodded, unable to speak. He studied her for a long moment. She wasn't what he expected. He'd imagined someone strong, maybe stern, a woman who wanted to build a life from scratch. But she looked fragile, like a porcelain doll someone had packed wrong and broken somewhere along the way. Still, there was something proud in the way she held her chin, even when her eyes didn't meet his. "You came far," he said, almost gently. "Yes," she whispered, "farther than I thought I could." He took her bag from her trembling hands without another word. His touch was careful, deliberate, not a trace of roughness. Then he motioned toward his horse-drawn wagon waiting by the fence. The sheriff and a preacher stood nearby, ready to perform the quick ceremony arranged through letters and the local paper. Inside the small wooden office, the air was stifling. The preacher mumbled through the vows, his voice uncertain as though the words themselves didn't belong between these two people. Koa's hand was warm when he slipped the simple silver ring onto her finger. When it was her turn, she fumbled with his ring, her gloved fingers clumsy. Her voice shook as she whispered, "I do." When the papers were signed, the preacher offered a polite nod, and the sheriff muttered something about the union being legal. Outside, the townsfolk watched with curious, disapproving eyes. Eleanor felt their stares burning holes through her back. She tried to stand tall, but the weight of their judgment pressed down on her like a stone. Koa said little. He helped her onto the wagon and took the reins. As they left town, the rickety wheels clattering over the dry earth, she glanced over her shoulder. The station, her last link to the world she knew, grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind a haze of dust. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding between mesas and golden plains. The sun was low, spilling crimson light over the land. Eleanor stole glances at the man beside her. His profile was carved and calm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't speak, yet his silence didn't feel cold, and it felt solid, like a shelter. After a while, he asked quietly, "You ever been west before?" She shook her head. "Never," he nodded. "It takes getting used to. The wind here speaks loud. The nights are colder, but the stars, they'll make you forget every dark thing you ever knew." Eleanor looked at him then, truly looked. For the first time, she noticed kindness behind the strength. A man of few words, yes, but not unkind. Still, something inside her warned her to stay guarded. She pressed her gloved hands together, hiding the faint tremor in her fingers and the truth of what lay beneath the fabric. When they finally reached his land, a small cabin nestled against red cliffs, the sky had turned to violet. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand hovering just long enough to steady her but not to linger. She looked at the cabin, simple, clean, with smoke curling from the chimney. It was more than she dared hope for. "Welcome home," Koa said softly. For a moment she almost smiled. But as the desert wind swept through her skirts, Eleanor pulled her sleeves down a little tighter and lowered her eyes. She wasn't ready for him, or anyone, to see what she was still trying so desperately to hide. And though he didn't know it yet, Koa Redhawk had just married a woman whose scars told a story of survival, darker than any he had ever lived. The town of Sundown was still buzzing with talk the morning after the wedding. News traveled fast in a place with one saloon, one store, and too many opinions. Some said the Apache had gone mad taking a white woman for a wife. Others whispered that she must have been desperate to marry him. But neither Koa nor Eleanor paid them any mind as they began the strange, quiet rhythm of married life. For Eleanor, everything felt like walking on unfamiliar ground. The land was harsh and beautiful. Vast stretches of red sand, cliffs shaped by wind, and a silence that carried its own weight. Back in Boston, noise had always filled her days. The creak of carriages, the chatter of women in lace, the ringing of church bells. Here, even the wind seemed to pause and listen. They had been married only a day, yet the word husband still felt foreign on her tongue. She stole glances at him as they unpacked her meager belongings, a Bible, a few dresses, and a photograph of her mother. Koa moved with quiet purpose, lifting crates and tending to the horses with a steady strength. He said little, but every movement seemed deliberate, as if he carried the weight of promises he hadn't spoken. That evening, they shared their first meal as husband and wife, beans and bread by the fire. Koa sat across from her, his broad shoulders outlined by the flickering light. He didn't press her to talk, didn't pry into her story. It was both comforting and unnerving. Most men she had known filled silence with noise, but Koa's calm stillness demanded its own kind of honesty. After several minutes, he finally spoke. "You came all this way alone?" She nodded. "Yes, no family." She hesitated, her spoon pausing halfway to her lips. "No one who wanted me to stay." He didn't ask more. Instead, he said softly, "Then you start new here." His words were simple, but something in them stirred her chest. A strange flicker of hope that she quickly smothered. She wasn't sure she knew how to start new. When the fire burned low, Koa stood. "You take the bed," he said, nodding toward the small sleeping area curtained off from the rest of the cabin. "I'll stay near the fire." She looked up, startled. "You don't have to—" "I want you to rest," he interrupted gently. She studied his face, unreadable but kind. For a moment, she almost believed he meant it. "Thank you," she whispered. When she slipped behind the curtain, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The bed smelled faintly of cedar. She lay awake for hours, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his movements outside. He was a stranger, her husband in name, but still an unknown presence. And yet, she felt safer in that cabin than she had in years. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the cracks in the shutters. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee. Koa was already outside, chopping wood, his muscles moving like the rhythm of a drumbeat. She watched through the window, surprised at the peace that filled her chest. When he came in, she tried to thank him, but her words faltered. "You didn't have to. Make coffee." He shrugged, pouring her a tin cup. "You look like you needed it." A faint smile tugged at her lips before she could stop it. Later that week, they rode into town for supplies. The townsfolk stared as they passed, some openly, some pretending not to. Koa ignored them, but Eleanor could feel the burn of every pair of eyes. At the general store, a group of women whispered near the shelves, their voices sharp and thin. "Poor thing," one murmured. "She doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." "Or maybe she does," another replied with a smirk. Eleanor pretended not to hear, but her face flushed hot. She focused on the list in her hand, though her fingers trembled slightly. When they left, Koa spoke quietly but firmly. "You don't owe them a single thought," she swallowed hard. "I know." He stopped walking then, turning to face her. "They see what they want to see," he said. "They don't know what's here." He touched his chest lightly over his heart. For a long moment, she couldn't look away from him. The tenderness in his eyes startled her. It wasn't pity. It was something else, something gentler. That night, as they sat by the fire again, Eleanor finally found the courage to ask, "Why did you choose me? Out of all the women who must have answered your letter?" Koa thought for a long time before answering. "Because you wrote you wanted peace. Not wealth, not land, just peace." Her breath caught. No one had ever listened to her so simply. He added, his voice softer now. "A man who's seen war knows what peace is worth." She nodded, her eyes glistening. For the first time, she believed this marriage, and strange as it was, might not have been born of desperation alone. It might just be a beginning neither of them expected. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. Inside, two strangers sat in silence, not. The days settled into a rhythm at Koa Redhawk's cabin. Quiet, almost wordless, like the slow hum of the wind against the canyon walls. The silence wasn't heavy, but it carried the weight of two souls still learning how to share the same space without colliding. Eleanor spent her mornings sweeping the cabin's plank floor, boiling coffee, and tending to the little patch of garden that Koa had built behind the house. She was careful with everything she touched, as if afraid she might break it, or that it might break her. When she moved about, the long sleeves of her cotton dress brushed her wrists, hiding the marks beneath. Even in the heat, she never took off her gloves. Koa noticed, of course. He noticed everything. He watched her move like someone trained by pain. Quiet steps, quick hands, shoulders drawn inward. She never raised her voice, never laughed. She barely ate. When he spoke to her, she answered softly, politely, and always with her eyes down. He didn't press. He knew what it was to carry wounds invisible to others. His own scars, from battles, from prejudice, from a world that called him half man, half savage, had taught him patience. So he gave her space. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Koa returned from the stables and found Eleanor sitting on the porch with her sewing. Her bonnet lay beside her, and a strand of pale hair had fallen loose across her face. For a moment she didn't notice him. She was humming, a low, haunting tune that drifted into the air like smoke. He leaned against the railing quietly. "That song? Where's it from?" Startled, she stopped, her hands freezing mid-stitch. I don't know. My mother used to hum it when I was little." "Sounds sad," he said. "It is," she whispered, folding her hands in her lap. "It reminds me of home." He didn't say that home was a word that had never meant much to him either. Instead, he nodded and sat down a few feet away. They sat together as twilight deepened, the desert around them glowing like embers. For a few fleeting moments, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was easy. Later that night, Koa worked by the firelight mending a leather strap, while Eleanor busied herself washing dishes in the tin basin. Every now and then she glanced at him. His strong hands, the calm precision in his movements, the way his dark eyes softened when he looked at the fire. There was something steady about him, something she hadn't known a man could be, and yet her body didn't trust peace. When his chair creaked suddenly, her hand jerked, and the plate she was holding slipped from her grasp, shattering against the floor. The sound echoed in the small cabin like gunfire. She gasped, stumbling back. Koa immediately rose, holding out his hands. "It's all right," he said gently. "It's just a plate." But she was already trembling, her eyes wide, breath coming too fast. I'm sorry. I didn't mean, please, I didn't." He froze, realization dawning in his chest. She wasn't afraid of the sound. She was afraid of him. He knelt slowly, keeping his distance, and began picking up the pieces of broken porcelain. "You don't have to be sorry," he said softly. "No harm done." She didn't answer. Tears filled her eyes, and she turned away, pressing her hands against her face. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire crackling. Koa gathered the shards, tossed them aside, and rose quietly. He didn't touch her. He didn't say another word. He simply stepped outside, giving her space to breathe. The night air was cool and carried the scent of rain. Koa tilted his head toward the stars, his heart heavy. Whoever had been in her life before had taught her to fear everything, even her own breath. When he came back inside later, she was sitting by the bed, staring into the fire. Her eyes were swollen but dry now. She looked up as he entered and whispered, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For being like this." Her voice cracked. "You didn't marry a wife. You married a shadow." Koa crouched by the fire, his voice low but steady. "Shadows can't live without light." She looked at him, really looked for perhaps the first time. His face was carved from stone and gentleness all at once. He wasn't mocking her. He meant every word. He stood and turned toward the door. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow I'll show you where the wildflowers grow near the stream." And as he left, she felt something unfamiliar stir inside her chest. Something like gratitude. Or maybe the faintest flicker of trust. That night, long after the fire had burned down to embers, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the wind whisper against the cabin walls. Somewhere outside, she could hear Koa's footsteps pacing softly in the dirt, keeping watch. For the first time since she'd arrived in sundown, she wasn't afraid to close her eyes. The silence that had once felt suffocating now felt safe. It was the first fragile thread of connection, a quiet beginning in a cabin built for healing. The following week brought rain, rare and soft, turning the red desert earth dark and fragrant. From inside the cabin, Eleanor watched the drops trail down the window like small rivers, their steady rhythm soothing and sad all at once. The world outside shimmered in muted golds and grays, and for a moment, she almost forgot where she was. But peace, she had learned, was a delicate thing, and it never stayed long. Koa was outside, securing the horses before the storm thickened. His voice, low and calm, drifted in through the half-open door. Every time she heard him speak, a part of her tensed, not from fear of him, but from the memory of another man's voice, sharper, crueler, always followed by the sound of something breaking. She pressed her hands together tightly. Her gloves were damp, but she didn't take them off. She couldn't. They were her armor. When Koa came inside, shaking rain from his hair, he glanced at her and smiled faintly. "The rain's good for the corn. The ground's been thirsty." She nodded, her lips barely curving. Back east, it rained almost every week. He hung his coat by the fire. "Then you'll like it here today. I like it quiet," she said softly. "That makes two of us," he replied, his tone light but kind. The cabin filled with the sound of rain drumming on the roof. Eleanor sat near the fire, mending a torn hem while Koa carved a piece of cedar wood into the shape of a bird. The scent of smoke and wet earth mingled between them. Neither spoke much, yet the silence didn't feel hollow anymore. But as the evening deepened and the storm grew louder, something shifted. Thunder rolled across the canyon, deep and booming. A flash of lightning burst through the window, bright as fire. Eleanor froze. The next clap of thunder struck, sharp and violent. The needle slipped from her hand, piercing her finger. She gasped. And then the memories hit her. The sound of glass breaking. A man's voice slurred with drink. The sting of a belt across her back. "Speak when spoken to." Her body reacted before her mind could stop it. The needle fell. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Her eyes darted wildly toward the door, searching for escape, though there was none. Koa's head lifted at once. "Eleanor." She didn't hear him. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as another flash split the sky. "No, please don't," she whispered under her breath, shrinking against the wall. In 2 steps, he was beside her, but when he reached out, she flinched violently, covering her head with her arms. Koa froze. The sight tore at him. He dropped to one knee, keeping his hands low, his voice barely a whisper. "Eleanor, it's me." "You're safe." Her breathing was shallow, her shoulders rigid. The storm raged outside, but he stayed still, patient as stone. Minutes passed before her trembling eased. Finally, she lifted her head, her eyes glistening with confusion and shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what. I thought I was past it." Koa shook his head slowly. "Don't be sorry for remembering," he said. "The past doesn't listen when we tell it to go away." She blinked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Sometimes it feels like it's still there, like I never left that house." He didn't touch her. He only said softly, "You did leave. You're here now. That man's gone. His voice can't reach this place." Eleanor stared into the fire, the glow reflecting off her damp lashes. "He used to tell me I was worthless," she said, almost to herself. "That no one would ever want me if he didn't." Koa's jaw tightened. He looked into the flames for a long moment, then said, "He was wrong." She glanced at him, startled by the certainty in his tone. He met her gaze evenly. "There's strength in you. I see it, even if you don't." Something inside her broke then, not in pain, but in release. She turned her face away, trying to hide her tears, but he said nothing more. He simply added another log to the fire and sat beside her, silent and solid, a quiet protector against the storm outside and the one raging in her mind. When the thunder finally faded, Eleanor felt emptied, drained but lighter somehow. The worst of the memories had come and gone, and she was still breathing. She looked over at Koa, still sitting near her, whittling again as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. "Thank you," she said softly. He glanced up. For what? For not asking me to explain. He smiled faintly. You'll tell me when you're ready. Words heal better when they come on their own. That night, as the last drops of rain fell, Eleanor lay awake and listened to the steady rhythm of Koa's breathing from across the room. For the first time, the dark didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a shield, and somewhere deep inside her, the past began to lose its grip. Just a little. Morning broke clear and bright after the storm. The air smelled clean, the earth damp beneath the soft light of dawn. Birds sang from the junipers near the creek, and the world seemed washed new. Eleanor rose early, unable to sleep past the sunrise. Her heart still felt heavy from the night before. The storm had shaken something loose inside her, something old and tender. But she also felt strangely calm, as though the desert itself had heard her fear and taken some of it away. She slipped on her gloves and shawl and carried the laundry basket down to the stream behind the cabin. The water ran cool and clear, rippling over smooth stones. Kneeling on the bank, she began scrubbing Koa's shirts against the washboard, humming softly under her breath, the same tune her mother once sang when life still felt safe. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt a moment of peace. The air was warm, the sun kissed her cheeks, and she thought, just for a heartbeat, that she might be all right. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, startled to see Koa coming down the path carrying a bucket. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his skin bronzed by the sun. He looked every bit the part of a man born of this wild land, strength and calm wrapped in quiet dignity. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," she replied. A bit breathless, he knelt beside her, filling his bucket. "You don't have to do all this yourself. I can help." "I don't mind," she said quickly. "I like the sound of the water." He smiled slightly. "Then I'll let you have it to yourself." He turned to leave, but as he did, a breeze lifted the edge of her shawl and pushed her sleeve up past her wrist. Koa stopped mid-step. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing, just pale skin wet with sunlight. Then the light shifted and the truth appeared. The scars. Thin white lines crossed her forearm, some long and raised, others faint and faded, but all unmistakable. They ran in uneven paths, some looking like burns, others like lashes. They were the kind of marks that didn't happen by accident. Eleanor noticed his gaze too late. Her breath caught and she yanked the sleeve down, fumbling to cover her arm. He froze, the bucket slipping slightly in his hand. "Eleanor." She shook her head, backing up a step. "Please don't." His voice softened, low as the wind in the grass. "What happened to you?" She turned away, her voice trembling. "It doesn't matter." "Yes, it does," he said quietly. She hugged herself, shaking. "You wouldn't understand." Koa stood there for a long moment, his chest tight, torn between wanting to reach for her and fearing what that touch might do. Finally, he said, "Maybe I wouldn't, but I've seen pain. I've carried mine too." Eleanor's shoulders quivered. Her voice came out raw. "You don't know what it's like to be someone's property, to wake up every day wondering what you did wrong just by existing." Koa's throat tightened. He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "No," he said, "I don't know your pain. But I've known chains. Not made of iron, made of names, made of how people look at me, made of what they say I can't be." That made her look at him, really look. For the first time, she saw the echo of her own wounds reflected in his eyes. He nodded slightly. "Pain leaves marks, but it doesn't own you unless you let it." Her lip trembled and she whispered, "I wish I could believe that." "Then I'll believe it for you," he said simply. The words undid her. Her knees gave way and she sat down on the riverbank, her gloved hands clutching the hem of her skirt. Tears she hadn't planned to shed spilled freely. She hated that he'd seen, hated the shame, the exposure, but at the same time something in her felt lighter. It was the first time in years someone had seen her scars and not turned away in disgust or pity. Koa crouched a few feet away, not touching her, not forcing her to speak. The silence between them filled with the sound of running water and her soft, broken sobs. After a long while, he said quietly, "You don't have to hide them anymore. Not here." She looked up, startled. He held her gaze. "Steady. Kind. They're not what I see when I look at you." "What do you see then?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A woman who's still standing," he said. "That's more than most." When she finally rose, her eyes were red, but her shoulders a little straighter. The air felt cleaner, the world sharper. She couldn't meet his eyes again just yet, but as she walked back toward the cabin, she knew something had shifted. Koa watched her go. The image of those scars burned into his mind, not as marks of weakness, but as proof of everything she had survived. And though he said nothing, he made a silent vow to himself. No one would ever hurt her again. That evening, the world outside glowed copper and gold. The storm-washed land shimmered in the fading sun, and a faint breeze carried the scent of wild sage through the open window. Inside the cabin, the air felt heavy, not with anger, but with something unspoken. Eleanor sat by the fire, her hands still, her gloves folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't spoken much since the moment by the stream. She'd gone about her chores quietly, keeping to herself, her eyes distant. Yet beneath her calm, shame and fear warred like restless ghosts. Koa moved about the cabin in silence, feeding the fire, setting out supper. He didn't look at her directly, but his presence filled the space like steady warmth. Patient, waiting. When he finally spoke, his tone was soft. "You don't owe me words, not if they hurt to say." Eleanor's throat tightened. For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly she lifted her gaze toward him. "I know," she whispered, "but if I don't speak now, I never will." He nodded once and sat across from her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. She took a deep breath. "The man I was married to, before you." She paused, her hands twisting together. "He wasn't what my family said he was. Everyone thought he was a gentleman, educated, refined, charming. But when the door closed, when no one was watching, he became someone else." Her voice cracked and she stared into the flames as if afraid to meet his eyes. "He hurt me, not just with his hands, but with his words. He made me believe I was the reason for everything wrong in his life. I thought if I tried harder, if I was quieter, he'd stop. But it never stopped." Koa's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting her speak. "He burned me once," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "With a candle. Said it was to teach me to behave." Koa's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. But still he said nothing, only listened. "He died 2 winters ago," she continued. "Fell from his horse while drunk. When I went to my family for help, they wouldn't let me in. My father said I'd brought shame by not keeping my husband happy. My mother couldn't even look at me. They told me to go and said no man would ever want a woman like me." Tears slid down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. "So I left. I sold my wedding ring, found a paper listing men in the territories seeking wives, and wrote to you. I didn't know who you were, and only that you didn't sound cruel. You wrote about wanting peace." She swallowed hard. "I wanted that too. I just didn't think I deserved it." Koa rose slowly and crouched beside her chair. His voice was low, careful. "You deserve more than peace, Eleanor." She shook her head, unable to look at him. "No, you don't understand what you've taken on." "I'm broken," he shook his head. "You are not broken," her breath hitched. "Then what am I?" He met her eyes. "Surviving." Something in the way he said it, steady, sure, like an oath, reached the part of her that still believed in light. "You didn't have to marry me," she whispered. "You could have chosen someone whole." He held her gaze, unwavering. "Maybe I didn't want someone whole. Maybe I wanted someone who knows what it costs to keep standing." For a moment, neither moved. The fire popped softly, the only sound between them. Eleanor looked at him, really looked, and saw not pity, but understanding. His face was shadowed with pain of his own, old and silent, yet it matched hers in a way that made her heart ache. "Did they hurt you too?" she asked gently. He took a long breath. "Men like me," he said, "were taught early that the world didn't want us. My mother was Apache, my father white. I belonged to both and to neither. I've been called savage by one side and traitor by the other. So yes, I've been hurt, but I learned to turn pain into something that feeds the fire inside." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. "I don't have that kind of strength," he smiled faintly. "You do. You just don't see it yet." Silence settled again, softer this time, lighter. She didn't feel the need to hide her face or pull down her sleeves. The fire painted the room in gold, and for the first time her scars didn't feel like secrets. When she finally whispered, "Thank you," her voice carried more than gratitude. It carried relief and the beginning of trust. Koa stood, his gaze gentle. Sleep, Eleanor. The land's quiet tonight. Let it hold you. She nodded, her heart trembling. As she lay down, the firelight flickered against the walls, and she realized that the shadows didn't frighten her anymore. For the first time in years, she slept without dreaming of pain, and Koa, sitting by the dying fire, kept watch, not because he had to, but because some part of him already knew protecting her was no longer duty, it was devotion. The days that followed moved gently, like the slow flow of a creek after a storm. Eleanor began to wake before sunrise, drawn by the peace of the desert morning. She would step outside wrapped in her shawl, feeling the cool wind brush her face as the first light touched the mesas. The land was quiet but alive. Hawks circled overhead. Wildflowers trembled in the wind, and somewhere far off, coyotes called to one another. In that stillness, she began to breathe differently, slower, deeper, steadier. Koa often joined her, though he didn't speak much. Sometimes he would sit on the porch steps with his coffee, whittling a piece of cedar wood into shapes. A horse, a feather, a small bird. Other mornings he would saddle his horse and head out to tend the cattle, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the sound of the wind. She liked it that way. There was comfort in his silence, in the way he never demanded anything from her. Each evening, when he returned, the rhythm of life between them grew easier. They would share supper, speak of small things, the way the creek had risen, the trail he'd followed, the new cactus bloom she'd seen near the well. Slowly, the silence that once weighed heavy between them turned into something warm and safe. One afternoon, while Koa repaired the corral fence, Eleanor brought him water. The sun was bright and his skin glistened with sweat. When he turned to take the jug from her, their hands brushed. A brief touch, but enough to send a tremor through her chest. He looked at her, eyes deep and searching. "You're not afraid of me anymore," he said softly. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I don't think I ever was. I was just afraid of myself." Koa tilted his head slightly. "And now?" "Now?" She looked toward the horizon, the endless blue stretching over red earth. "Now I think maybe I can learn who I am again." He nodded once, his expression unreadable but kind. "That's good. The land teaches patience. It'll wait for you to remember." She smiled, though her throat ached with emotion. "You speak like the wind has taught you things." He gave a quiet laugh. "Maybe it has. When you live with silence long enough, it starts talking back." That evening, Eleanor decided to do something she hadn't done in years: sing. It was after supper, when the world outside was painted in deep gold and purple. Koa sat on the porch sharpening his knife when he heard it, a soft voice, low at first, rising like the slow swell of a prayer. The song was one her mother used to sing, an old English lullaby, tender and haunting. The words carried across the air like ripples over water. Koa set the knife down and listened. The sound wrapped around him, fragile, trembling, yet full of something pure. When she finished, she turned and found him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable but his eyes bright with something she couldn't name. "I didn't mean for you to hear," she said quickly. "Embarrassed, I'm glad I did," he replied. "Your voice, it feels like morning after rain." Her cheeks flushed. "I haven't sung in years." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "He used to say my voice sounded like whining." Koa's jaw tightened. He was wrong. She looked down, then up again, her eyes wet. "You make me forget what he said." "That's because his words were never the truth," Koa said quietly. "They were chains, and you've already broken them." For a moment, silence hung between them. Not heavy, but electric, like the pause before something begins. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Do you ever think about the past?" Koa looked out at the darkening desert. "Sometimes, but I don't live there anymore. I want that," she whispered. "To stop living in what hurt me." He turned back to her, his gaze steady and warm. "Then start by seeing what's in front of you." Their eyes met, and the kind of look that lasts too long, that says everything neither dares to speak. She felt her breath catch, her pulse fluttering like a bird in her chest. And for the first time, she didn't look away. Later that night, as she lay beneath the quilt he'd brought in from the line, she realized something had changed. The nightmares that usually haunted her sleep didn't come. Instead, she dreamed of running water, sunlight, and the sound of her own laughter. When she woke in the quiet dawn, Koa was already outside, chopping wood. Through the window, she watched him, tall, strong, calm, and her heart whispered something she wasn't ready to name. But she knew this much. The scars no longer defined her. The desert was teaching her how to heal, and Koa, without words, without promises, was teaching her how to feel alive again. The wind that evening carried the scent of rain, though the sky remained clear. The land shimmered in shades of amber as the sun sank behind the ridges. Inside the cabin, the firelight painted the walls in gold and everything felt still, the kind of stillness that comes before something sacred. Eleanor sat by the hearth, sewing the torn hem of her dress. She hummed softly to herself, unaware that Koa was watching her from the doorway. He'd been quiet all day, lost in his thoughts as he worked outside. But now, as he watched her, the way her head tilted when she concentrated, the way the firelight softened her hair, something stirred inside him, something deeper than want. When she looked up, their eyes met and she smiled, shy, uncertain, but real. "Long day?" she asked. He nodded. "The fence is fixed. The cattle will stay where they should now." She chuckled softly. "Seems like everything listens to you around here." He leaned against the doorframe. "Not everything." The words lingered, low and heavy. Eleanor's needle paused mid-stitch. There was a pulse beneath the silence, a hum that neither of them could ignore. Koa stepped forward slowly, as though crossing an invisible line. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to feel his warmth. "You don't have to look away anymore," he said quietly. Her hands trembled. "I'm not hiding." He tilted his head slightly. "Not from me, but from yourself." She swallowed hard. "Maybe I don't know how to do anything else." Koa crouched in front of her, close enough that the firelight caught the gold flecks in his eyes. "Then let me show you how." He reached out slowly, so slowly, until his fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve. She flinched, instinctively pulling back. His hand stopped, open, waiting. "I won't touch you unless you let me," he said. The gentleness in his voice broke something inside her. She looked into his eyes, calm, patient, full of a warmth she hadn't known could exist. After a long breath, she nodded. Koa's hand moved again, this time lifting her sleeve inch by inch until the pale skin of her forearm was revealed. The scars glimmered in the firelight, a map of pain and survival. He didn't speak. He didn't gasp or pity. Instead, he looked at them as though they were sacred, proof that she had lived. His fingers hovered just above her skin, not quite touching. "Does it hurt when someone looks?" he asked softly. "Sometimes," she whispered, "because it reminds me." "And now?" She looked down at his hand, steady, warm, kind, and then back at his face. "Now it feels different." He let his fingertips trace one of the faint lines, light as a breath. "The body remembers," he said, "but so does the heart. You can teach it new things." Her breath trembled, not from fear, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. He moved his hand from her arm to her wrist, then to her hand, threading his fingers through hers. The warmth of his touch sank deep, steadying her heartbeat. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Why are you so gentle with me?" "Because no one ever was," he said quietly. A tear slid down her cheek, but she smiled through it. "No one ever was." He reached up and brushed the tear away with his thumb. "Then let that change tonight." The fire popped softly, and for a long time they said nothing. The moment stretched between them, fragile and sacred. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice trembling but strong. "When you look at me, I don't feel small anymore." Koa's eyes softened. "That's because you're not. You never were." She exhaled shakily, the last of her old fear slipping away. Her shoulders relaxed. Her scars, once a mark of shame, now felt like part of a story still being written. He pressed her hand gently to his chest, where his heartbeat thudded slow and sure beneath her palm. "Do you feel that?" "Yes, that's what I see when I look at you," he said. "Life, strength, not the pain. The proof that you survived it." Her lip trembled and she whispered, "You make it sound beautiful." "It is," he said simply. The wind outside sighed through the cottonwoods and the fire burned low. When he finally let go of her hand, she didn't feel empty. She felt lighter. She didn't need saving anymore. He hadn't taken her pain. He had shown her how to carry it differently. and as she watched him rise and bank the fire for the night, her heart whispered a truth she couldn't deny any longer. She was falling in love with the man who had seen her scars and called them strength. Morning came soft and golden, spilling light through the cabin windows. The night before still lingered in Eleanor's mind. Not the fear, not the shame, but the way Koa's voice had wrapped around her like warmth itself. For the first time in years, she didn't wake to the sound of her own heartbeat pounding with dread. She woke to quiet, to peace. Koa was outside, splitting wood in the yard. The sound of the axe against the log echoed across the valley, steady and sure. Eleanor stood at the doorway for a long while, watching him. The strength in his arms, the calm in his movements. It wasn't just power, it was patience. The kind of patience that waits for someone to come back to themselves. She realized as she watched him that she was ready. Ready to live again. Ready to feel. When he came in for breakfast, she had already set the table. He gave her a nod of thanks as he sat, but something in her expression caught his attention. She wasn't the same woman who'd arrived trembling and silent. Her eyes held a quiet light, fragile but steady. "You're thinking about something," he said, breaking the bread. She smiled faintly. "About everything. Good thoughts?" "Mostly," she hesitated. I think I've been afraid to let good things last. Every time I had something kind, it was taken away." Koa nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time you stop expecting the taking." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "And start believing in the keeping?" He smiled. "Something like that." They ate in silence after that, not awkward but full. Each sound, the clink of dishes, the soft sigh of wind against the door, felt intimate, as if the cabin itself had begun to breathe with them. Later that day, they rode together to the far ridge where the land opened wide into endless sky. From there, the whole valley stretched beneath them, wild, vast, untamed. Eleanor sat astride her horse, her shawl fluttering in the wind. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Koa nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "It's where I come when I need to remember who I am." She looked at him. "And who is that?" He thought for a moment. "A man learning that strength doesn't mean silence, that sometimes it means being gentle." Her eyes softened. "You've taught me that too." He turned toward her. "No, Eleanor. You taught yourself. I just stood close enough for you to see it." The wind caught her hair, blowing it across her face, and he reached out, slow, reverent, to tuck it behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek, lingering just long enough for her to feel the weight of his care. Neither spoke. The air between them shimmered, full of something raw and new. Finally, she whispered, "Why me, Koa?" He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You could have chosen anyone, someone unbroken, unscarred." He shook his head. "Scars don't make you unworthy, Eleanor. They make you real, and real is all I've ever wanted." Her throat tightened. "You make it sound so simple." "It is," he said quietly. "When the heart knows." She drew in a trembling breath. "And yours knows?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he took her hand, firm, sure, and pressed it against his chest. His heartbeat thudded beneath her palm, steady and strong. "It's known since the first time I saw you flinch and still look back with fire in your eyes." Her tears came before she could stop them. "I didn't think anyone could love me again." He leaned closer, his voice low. "Then let me be the first to prove you wrong." Her lips parted, trembling, but no words came. The world seemed to narrow until there was only him. His warmth. His scent, the steady beat beneath her fingers. And then, finally, she whispered, "I love you, Koa." The words felt strange and wild on her tongue. Fragile, yet fierce. Koa's breath caught, his eyes shining with something deep and unguarded. "Say it again," he murmured. She smiled through her tears. "I love you." He closed the space between them, his forehead resting gently against hers. "And I you," he whispered. "Not because you need saving, but because you remind me what it means to live." They sat there on the ridge as the sun began to dip, hand in hand, the sky burning with color. Neither spoke again. They didn't need to. Love had finally spoken, and softly like the desert wind. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor believed it would stay. That evening, the world seemed to pause. The desert stretched wide and endless, glowing beneath a sky scattered with 1,000 stars. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sage and rain-soaked earth. It was the kind of night that made the land feel alive, breathing, listening, holding secrets in its silence. Eleanor stood outside the cabin, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The door creaked softly as Koa stepped out to join her. He carried 2 tin mugs of coffee, steam curling into the crisp night air. He handed her one, his hand brushing hers, warm and sure. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Too much in my heart tonight." He smiled faintly. "That's not a bad thing." They stood side by side, looking out toward the dark horizon. The moon was full, silvering the ridges and casting the valley in a soft glow. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote called, its cry echoing across the canyon. Eleanor took a slow sip of her coffee, then glanced at him. "Do you ever think about what's next?" He looked down at her, brow furrowing slightly. "Next?" she nodded. "For us," his gaze softened. "Every day." Her breath caught. "And?" He set his mug down on the porch rail, then turned fully toward her. "Eleanor," he began, his voice steady but tender. "When I sent that letter asking for a bride, I didn't expect you. I didn't expect someone who'd walk into my life and make the silence feel like music. You were supposed to be a stranger. But you became home." Her eyes filled with tears, the kind that came not from pain but from being truly seen. He continued, his voice low. "I know what it's like to live with ghosts, to carry the weight of what others have done to you. But I also know what it means to choose what comes next. And if you'll have me, I want our next days to be together." Eleanor's lips parted in surprise. "You're asking me again?" "I'm asking you for real this time," he said softly. "Not as a mail-order bride sent by chance, but as the woman I choose." She laughed through her tears, shaking her head. "Koa, I came here believing no one could ever love me again." He reached for her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles over her skin. "And now?" "Now," she whispered, "I believe again." He smiled, and small, quiet, full of meaning. "Then let me say it plain. I love you, Eleanor. All that you are, all that you've been through, every scar, every silence. You're the strongest person I've ever known." Her tears fell freely now, but she didn't hide them. She looked up at him, her voice trembling with truth. "You found me when I didn't know I was lost. And you stayed when I didn't know I could be found." The wind stirred between them, cool and gentle, as though the desert itself was listening. Koa lifted his hand to her cheek, brushing away her tears. "No one will ever make you feel small again," he whispered. "Not while I breathe." Eleanor's heart ached, not with fear but with a deep, overflowing love. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. "Then promise me something," she said softly. "Anything. Promise we'll keep healing, together, no matter how long it takes." He smiled, his breath warm against her skin. "That's a promise I'll never break." The night wrapped around them as he drew her into his arms. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, the sound that had become her peace. They stood there until the fire inside the cabin dimmed to embers, until the stars began to fade into dawn. The land shifted from silver to gold and a new day was born. Eleanor looked out at the horizon, her hand still in his. "The desert feels different now," she said. Koa followed her gaze. "That's because you've changed it," he said quietly. "You gave it something new, hope." She smiled, turning toward him. "No," she whispered. "You did." He shook his head, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We both did." Then, under the rising sun, he kissed her, slow, certain, and full of everything they hadn't been able to say before. From that day forward, the scars that once marked her past became symbols of her strength. The land that once seemed harsh became home, and the man who had once been a stranger became her heartbeat beneath the endless desert sky. Their love didn't erase the pain. It rewrote it, turned it into something living, something that could grow. And as the wind carried the sound of her laughter across the open plains, Koa whispered into her hair, "You're free now, Eleanor, truly free."